Notions of diversity and imperatives to respond to it at institutional and practice levels are now well established in the discursive terrain of education. In this podcast, however, and in the one which follows, I'm going to suggest that whilst this focus is a welcome one, the discourse around diversity has led us to consider it in a very particular way. The conventions around which we think about difference in the classroom have had very real positive consequences, but they're not the only method of thinking about diversity. And here, I'll suggest that a different discursive agenda is possible. To begin, it serves to establish what the conventions around diversity actually look like. They stem in general from a concern with differential educational achievement, and by an historic sequence of political and moral panics surrounding the systematic underachievement of some groups in education. It began in the 1950s and early 60s, with concern focused on the relative underachievement of working class children. Throughout the 1960s, 70s and 80s, this focus broadened to encompass ethnicity and achievement, around the reasons why, in particular, Black, Bangladeshi and Pakistani children did systematically less well in education than their white, Chinese and Indian contemporaries. Alongside this has been an oscillating concern with gender, firstly with the underachievement of girls and their systematic exclusion from conventionally masculine areas of study. As achievement amongst girls has gradually increased, focus has instead turned to why boys have fallen behind. More recently, interest in diversity has focused on the way in which various demographic characteristics intersect with one another to produce complex patterns of achievement and underachievement. One outcome of this has been an intense focus on white working class boys as the group most likely to underachieve in education. Each of these focal turns has heralded important responses and attempts to improve social justice in education. Each has also generated new languages which define legitimacy in the ways in which we talk about diversity in education and how we explain differences in achievement. A number of explanatory themes have emerged in an attempt to explain and respond to differential achievement. In general, these can be situated in terms of whether they locate the genesis of underachievement within the home or the school, or in an interplay between the two. The earliest explanations situated underachievement in terms of deficits in the home. This might be as a result of poverty and financial constraint, or material deprivation, which restrict living conditions or access to educational supportive materials. Similarly, explanations focus on the attitudes and values of the home, and the ways in which things like a lack of emphasis on the importance of education might hinder achievement, what is known as cultural deprivation. A slightly more subtle reading, known as situational constraint, suggests an interplay between these two, emphasising the way in which material and contextual factors shape culture. To illustrate, cultural deprivation explanations might suggest that working class families emphasise immediate gratification, and thus don't teach their children to put off immediate pleasures for more substantial future ones. Situational constraint approaches, in contrast, would suggest that this is simply because, in contexts of poverty, rewards are few and far between. In this context, overlooking a pleasure would be unwise. A second group of explanations emphasise the role of education, school and teachers in producing differential achievement. On one hand, this has conventionally focused on institutional expectations of different groups, systematic biases held against particular classes, genders and ethnicities. Elsewhere, it's focused on the degree to which access to high-quality education is available to particular communities. Between these two groups of explanations lies a middle ground, which emphasises the interactions between home and school. Traditionally, these have emphasised two areas: biases in the curriculum which lord the cultural capital and experience of some groups over others, and the ways in which students form subcultures in response to educational processes. All of this has been significant in shaping educational provision and practice, and an agenda which focuses on the very different outcomes of education received by different groups is of course crucial. Equally though, I would suggest that it only legitimises one way of talking about diversities at the expense of others. It produces a safe terrain outside of which we seldom wander, and in this session I'd like us to think about how we might disrupt these tendencies and wander into different geographies of discourse around diversity. In short, how we might think and talk about the complexities of difference in different ways.